Hey guys, seems like we've come to the end of our course in ethics, and we've given various examples of thought experiments as we've tried to apply different ethical theories to various situations. And you may need to go back through your lectures and or syllabus to recall some of those. You can think of, again, movies like The Purge in regard to utilitarianism, or the classical Nazis at the door in regard to Kantian deontological type ethic, things of that nature. However, we haven't gone through a specific argument as it pertains to ethics in regard to a particular position. And of course, there are various hot button topics that we could discuss, cultural hot button topics. There's not a shortage of those, whether it be at least at the time of this recording, whether it be gender identity, whether it be the nature of marriage, whether it be, of course, the abortion issue. Regardless of whatever aisle of the side of the aisle one is on in those regards, these are cultural hot button topics that most likely cover various cultures, not solely just the American scene. Now, I thought that we would look at one of these particular hot button topics and you try to use some premises within an argument in regard to one of these topics that, for the most part, would be accepted by all of these ethical systems. Of course, aside from moral relativism and then even utilitarianism. Now, the reason that you will be familiar with my comment, or you'll be able to make sense of my comment in saying that we can't really expect the truthfulness of these premises in moral relativism, because, as you know already, that moral relativism denies the truth, the objective or absolute claims of truth in regard to morality, moral relativism, hence. And then, as you may recall, as you should know by this point, it'd be very difficult to argue, at least in regard to act utilitarianism, pure original utilitarianism. It'd be really hard to argue for the truthfulness of any particular premise, moral premise, a premise that contains what we would consider to be a moral truth. It would be difficult to argue from utilitarianism because, of course, remember, if the numbers work, if the pleasure or the good for the most people, the greatest number, the greatest flourishing, whatever, is not the consequence of that one particular premise, then you can reject that premise as a utilitarian, or not. You can, but you would, if you're a utilitarian, you'd basically have to reject that premise. However, some of these premises are so, like we talked about in regards to moral relativism and utilitarianism, that some of these things that we would call these moral intuitions, maybe these moral facts that we didn't want to throw out, they still seem more plausibly true than they do false. So what we want to do here in this last round out type lecture, again, is look at one of these cultural hot button topics and construct a syllogism in regard to the immorality of this particular position. Now, what is that position? Well, as stated, it's going to be a hot button topic, and so it will be looking at your slides here, the pro-life position. Now, this argument is not going to be specific to me in the construction of the syllogism, in the formulation of the argument, or probably, strictly speaking, in regard to the defense of each premise. The reason I say so is because this is an argument that is put forward by thinkers such as Greg Kokel, such as Scott Klusendorf, such as Schwartz, whom you'll see in just a few moments. this particular argument is not germane to only one particular individual. This is an argument, a general but very strong argument, again, that is proffered by many of the thinkers already mentioned, and most likely proffered by many others as well. So this argument is going to, a lot of the material for this argument, again, is going to be gleaned from a book, a text called Understanding Abortion, Mixed Feelings to Rational Thought, and this is by Stephen Schwartz. But again, this argument is not going to be only specific to this individual. Again, many thinkers have utilized this flavor, this flow of argumentation in regard to the pro-life position. Again, Scott Klusendorf, Greg Kokel, among Clinton Wilcox, among others. Now, what is this particular argument? Well, first, let's go through the problems. And before we go through this, I find it very ironic or coincidental that even just today, as I was preparing to go through this argument with you here for our lecture, I was in the library at a state college, and I overheard a group of students who were literally having this very debate. Excuse me. In regard to the abortion question. And so the coincidence, the irony, what's so, lack of better terms, crazy here is that the argument that you're about to hear, that we're about to walk through, was roughly the same argument that I called these students over and presented them with, and allowed them to chew on. I can honestly say that more than a few of the students were really intrigued with this particular argument. It even seemed as if one student may have been completely swayed, completely reversed their position as to what they had thought previously in regard to this topic. So, having said that, does the procedure, let's just follow our slides here, does the procedure of abortion terminate the life of an existing innocent human being? Right, this is the question before us, because there are so many sidetracks in regards to this topic that are, to be frank, irrelevant to the consideration of whether or not this being in the womb is a human being, a human person, or is it something else? Now look, we've got this spelled out pretty easily here. If no, right, if the answer is no, that abortion does not terminate the life of an existing innocent human being, if it's no, then the procedure of abortion is justified, as there's no taking of innocent life. Again, as these other thinkers have pointed out, it's the equivalent of going to a medical practitioner of some sort and removing a wart, an abscess, a tumor, something of that nature. There's nothing controversial about it. No one should give any thought to it. However, if this being in the womb is an innocent human being, and this is terminated, right, then the procedure is a serious moral wrong. So the question before us that we have to consistently ask is not the irrelevancy of various objections and whatnot that we'll go through, but what is the being in the, whatever that is in the womb, what is that? What is that? The answer to that question is paramount to dialoguing or discussing or wrestling through or looking at the implications of any of the other objections. So you've got to constantly keep that one question before you. What am I assuming is the being in the womb? Whatever it is that's in the womb, what am I assuming, what am I presupposing that thing is? What is it, right? That's the important question here. Now, An objection. Suppose that one were to claim that there's a difference between a human being, right, and a human person. So imagine that someone says, well, you know what, maybe there's a difference between a human being and a human person. Now this will be addressed later because this is going to be one of our philosophical type objections, right? The difference between a human being and a human person, if there is one. We'll address that later. Now, what we're going to do here, and during the course of this ethics class, we have it going through syllogisms. Usually that's covered obviously in logic, but then even also many times in an introduction to philosophy type class. So just for clarification's sake, a syllogism is just the fancy philosophical jargon, the fancy philosophical word for an argument, right? A formal argument. The syllogism is the structure, the house, so to speak, the building of the argument. So this here, you see 1, 2, and 3. You've got two premises and a conclusion. This is what's called a categorical deductive syllogism, meaning that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to follow. Just as night follows the day, it has to be true. The conclusion has to be true if the premises are true and the argument is logically valid, meaning that there are no formal rules of logic broken there. Now, our syllogism here is, again, not necessarily particular to me at all. This is a flavor of argument, as mentioned already, but the premises essentially are: 1, it is morally wrong to terminate innocent human beings. 2, abortion terminates innocent human beings, therefore abortion is wrong. We could say morally wrong there. So let's look at that again very quickly. It is morally wrong to terminate innocent human beings. Now, remember, most of our ethical theories, aside from utilitarianism and moral relativism, this first premise is accepted by virtually any ethical system that we've discussed, that it's morally wrong to terminate or to kill innocent human beings. In fact, the word for this is just murder, right? The definition of murder is to kill an innocent human being. Now, that first premise is uncontroversial, right? There are no formal rules broken in this particular argument. It's logically valid, right? So now what we need to make sure of is that the premises are actually true, right? Because if the premises are true, then, or if the premises are not true, then the conclusion here, therefore abortion is wrong, just doesn't follow. Well, it seems again that no one is going to necessarily deny the first premise, that it's morally wrong to terminate innocent human beings. Most everyone, again, at least in regard to our ethical theories, everyone agrees with that. Nobody's going to reject that syllogism or that premise. No one's going to try to get out of this argument, this syllogism. Nobody's going to try to get out of the conclusion by denying the truthfulness of the first premise. Now, the second premise is going to be our controversial premise, right? Abortion terminates innocent human beings. That is to say, without the euphemism, is that abortion kills a human being, an innocent human being, rather. Now, this, to get out of the argument, to get out of this conclusion, because remember, if the premises are true, the conclusion follows like night follows the day. That's just logic. Now, to get out of this, then, the denial of the second premise is most likely what you're going to run into. Most opponents of this particular pro-life position are going to deny the truthfulness of premise 2. They're going to say, no, abortion does not terminate an innocent human being. That thing in the womb, whatever it is either not a human being, or whatever else they may try to say on that side of the aisle. But they're definitely going to deny the truthfulness of the second premise. So if you were to adopt this position, say the pro-life position in this case, if you were to adopt this position, then your job, so to speak, here is going to have to defend the truthfulness of the second premise. Now, can that be done? And another way to ask that is like our slide here says, is there any evidence to determine that the being in the womb is actually a human being, right? Of course, we're going to hear, no, it's not a human being, it's a clump of cells. No, it's not a human being. Excuse me. Long day. No, it's not a human being. Fill in the blank. Basically, we're going to have to give reasons as to why this is not a human being, and so therefore it's okay to terminate this thing. Or I may say, well, since it's not alive anyway, this being in the womb, whatever it is, there's no termination involved because it's not alive, right? That may be an objection there. Now, let's look at some important questions that we want to consider. What exactly is, again, this is our fundamental question, what is the unborn? All other questions regarding the situation are absolutely secondary to this consideration. Again, Greg Kokel likes to give this example. Say if you have a child and your child comes up behind you and your child says, "Daddy, can I kill this?" Well, most parents are going to immediately say, what? Say they're turned looking the other direction, they don't see what the child has, and they just hear the child say, maybe through the next room, "Daddy, can I kill this? Mommy, can I kill this?" What is the parent going to do at that point? Right, they're going to want to know what their child has, right? Well, what is it? What do you have? You have a roach? Is it the family cat? Is it your brother? You know what? This is the thought experiment that Greg Kokel likes to give. What is it, right? And so again, the question then there, in analogous fashion is, well, what is that in the womb, right? Before we can make a decision as to whether or not we can terminate this, whatever it is in the womb, we have to determine what is this thing in the womb. Of course, the pro-life position wants to say that this is a human being, right? Just as you or I. Everything else is inconsequential to this consideration at this point. This has to be the fundamental question. This has to be the question that we keep before us as we progress through the argument: is what is this being in the womb? This in there, what is it, right? If the unborn is simply a non-living, non-human, non-person, then why does the Christian, right, these evangelical Christians, Roman Catholics, right, whoever, secular pro-life proponents, why does the Christian, or anyone that is interested in the topic for that matter, give any concern at all to the situation? Again, if the unborn is simply a non-living, it's not alive, whatever it is, it's not alive, whatever it is, it's not human, whatever it is, it's not a person, then no one should care, right? No one should mind at all as to the decision that's going to be made here. Well, what we're going to try to do then, again, is defend that second premise, that this abortive procedure will terminate the life of an innocent human being. So let's, again, moving along with our slides here, look at that to see if this can be defended. From the moment of conception, this being in the womb is a distinct living organism, separate from the body of either the mother or the father, right? Now, can we actually show that to be the case? I had a quick glitch, but we're back. So as we were saying, the mother or the father's body, this particular being in the womb that we're going to try to argue, is separate from either of these. Which will obviously address at least one of the objections before it even is tossed out, that this is part of the woman's body, right? Which is a usual objection, right? That women can do with their own bodies what they would like, right? Also, another question we're going to have is, or that we're going to address, is the being in the womb, is it alive or living, right? Is this being, is it alive or is it living? This is what we're going to look at too in defense of this second premise. Now, let's first look at that. And our slides here address that. There's no step in the process of conception. And when I say no step in the process of conception, that's euphemistic, right? You can figure out that process of conception. So no step in the process of conception Is there any non-life that is involved? The entire process of conception and fertilization is literally surrounded by, and this is a very key concept to memorize, to commit to memory when we talk about this, is that, well, we don't know when life begins. We don't know if it's alive or if it's not, all these sorts of things. Remember, the entire process of conception and fertilization is literally surrounded by life. This is just basic biology, right? This can be confirmed in any basic embryology textbook. This is not a matter of religion or philosophy or one's cultural persuasion. This is just basic embryology, that a living man connects with a living woman to introduce a living sperm with a living egg, which is then fertilized, producing its living consequent, meaning that it's reproducing rapidly. Cellular development is happening. There's no non-biological life involved in the process. Again, all of this is living, lack of better terms there. The whole stage, the whole process, the whole track, so to speak, is living. This is probably one of the most odd and silly, honestly, objections to this pro-life position. Well, we don't know when life begins. Well, yes, we obviously do. I mean, this is just, again, basic embryology. But even here, a philosophical question might be, well, if we don't know when life begins, well, then the least logical thing to do would be to say, destroy this potential thing, even though we don't know if it's alive or not, right? I mean, we wouldn't do this in regard to anything else. If a man, woman, or child that we already accept to be a human being and a person was in a car accident, and we were contemplating giving this individual medical care, no one would say, well, we don't know if this person's alive or dead, so let's just don't give them medical care. Right? We wouldn't do this anywhere else. In fact, if we were confused about the situation, if we did not have knowledge as to whether they were alive or dead, we would obviously, on the safe side, say, well, we don't know if they're alive, we don't know if they're dead, so we will give medical care in the case that they are actually alive. So this is just an odd objection. So this consequent is a living zygote. Again, so this just completes the process of the mother and the father, the male and the female coming together, living sperm, living egg, fertilization, living zygote, the whole process. So here, as we've just mentioned, division and multiplication immediately commence, and the living organism will continue on with its course, right? All things being equal, without some sort of interfering circumstance, it will continue in this process. There is no dead or non-life being involved within the entire process. So, now the question posed as an objection, when does life begin? Again, this just, as we've just stated, this just seems to be answered so very easily, right? So there's our first objection answered. Just simply, if one were to try to say, well, no, this doesn't terminate the life of an innocent human being, remember premise 2, abortion doesn't terminate the life of an innocent human being, simply because we don't know when life begins, or it's not alive at all anyway. Well, this just seems to dismiss that rather easily. Now, some might immediately say something like, well, this is just a clump of cells, but this is scientifically speaking, remember, you and I are clumps of cells, right? If you're trying to issue this as a if you're trying to give this as some sort of scientific objection, well, then scientifically, you and I are merely clumps of cells, just more of them, right? So that really is something like a bad philosophical type objection, because the number of cellular the number of cells in one's body has nothing to do with the personhood or the beingness of that particular person, right? So this clump of cells thing is just silly. One, it's just not a clump of cells, and we're about to go through that. Let's just concede that it was something as simple as a clump of cells. We're about to see why that wouldn't be true anyway. So again, this is not a biological objection, but a philosophical objection, as you and I and all others are a conglomeration of cells, only more of them. So this being in the womb, again, whatever this being is clearly alive. And what is this being in the womb? A mere clump of cells in the active process of accomplishing. So that is to say, what's happening, right? What's happening to this clump of cells? Now, many of those in the pro-life position will give this particular type of argument and leave it at that. I think that's insufficient. What we're about to go through is very important, but it's insufficient to leave on its own as an argument for this position, for the defense of premise 2. Nevertheless, it is important, and I think it's very beneficial, so we will go through them. 1. At 3 to 4 weeks, remember, most abortions happen around the 12-week mark. This is when most abortions occur. So already, though, at the 3 to 4 weeks past conception, the unborn object, whatever it is at this point, claims eyes, a spinal cord, a brain, thyroid gland, lungs, stomach, liver, kidneys, and intestines. It is also the case that the heart begins beating between the 18th and 25th days. The head is taking its definite shape, as well the arms and the legs are forming, and the fetus is 1/3 of an inch tall. Now remember, that's still only 1/3 of the way through where your normal abortion procedure would even take place at the 12th week, around the 12-week mark. Now, at the 4th week, again, we're still very far from where the normal procedure takes place. So merely at the 4th week, the eyes have their retinas and lenses, ear clefts, the arms and legs are developed with fingers and toes, and the fetus floats in the amniotic sac. The facial features are also visible at this point, adding to all that was described in the first point. So we've got everything that was already going on that we just mentioned in the previous slide. Now we have to add these attributes. Now, at 5 weeks, again, adding to what's already happening here. At 5 weeks, the mouth and the tongue form. The baby teeth are forming in the gums. The major muscle system is developed. The eyes are complete. The mouth has lips. The fingers and the toes, they're complete as well. And at 6 weeks, the fetus is swimming in surrounding fluid as each of these develop. Again, so clump of cells couldn't be further from the truth to say that this is a clump of cells. Now, at 8 weeks, the brain is complete. The brain waves are measurable on this particular device here that I have on the slide. The unborn object, might we say baby at this point, even though technically speaking we could leave that away. But the unborn object, whatever this being is capable of feeling pain, and during this phase is where a majority of abortion takes place. At 12 weeks, the fetus is 3.5 inches tall. The fetus swallows regularly, its vocal cords are complete, it cries silently, it also has fingernails actually appear, and it may start sucking its thumb at this point. Again, this is to add, all to what we already know, to what's already been mentioned previously. At 16 weeks, the fetus is 5.5 inches tall and its weight is around 6 ounces. The eyebrows and the lashes appear as it grasps with hands, swims, kicks, and somersaults. Right now, we're just starting to, we could be guilty now of what's called piling on, right? We're just piling on reasons to think that it's just absolutely asinine to suggest that this is a clump of cells. Now, at 20 weeks, the fetus has a chance of survival that is outside of the womb. It's already surviving. But now it even has, at 20 weeks, simply at that point in time, the chance to even survive outside of the womb as a premature infant. Now, you'll see on this citation down here, this footnote rather, just that these facts are, if you want more access to this, there's a text called Understanding Abortion, but it can also be found within another text called Way of Love 3 on page 24 of Rhonda Chervin's book there. Now, everything that we've listed so far, this is a very key point. Everything that we've listed so far concerning this being in the womb, whatever it is, are, one, uncontroversial, and two, they're agreed upon by all parties involved. What that means to say is no matter what side of the aisle that one happens to be on in regards to this debate, everything that's been said thus far, up to this point, is accepted by both sides of those in the know, right? Of those that actually are involved in this discussion, whether philosophically or scientifically. Everything discussed so far is not controversial. Again, it's not germane to just one, or it's not monopolized by just one particular religious group or school of thought or whatnot, but everybody agrees with these points that we've stated thus far. Now, what's odd about that is there must be something left then that would convince others that this, whatever it is in the womb, is still not a human being or a human person. But we've already seen, even up to this point, that position is in serious danger, right? In fact, we may even say that if that's all we knew at this point, what we've discussed thus far, if that's all we knew, then it would be relatively hard, very difficult, not to concede the truthfulness of premise 2. Just to add more, listen to this. Therefore, from the very moment of conception, by the way, if you haven't done this already, if you haven't seen this already, look at, I'm sure the video is on YouTube, it's on the internet at some point. I doubt very seriously that it'd be hard to, or difficult to find. But what happens at the moment of conception, this little ball, this surge of light that happens at the moment of conception, it's amazing. Check that out. But therefore, from the moment of conception, think about this. This being in the womb has his or her own DNA fingerprint, their own genetic code. That is to say, if somehow this being in the womb committed a crime and the authorities traced the DNA of the one that committed the crime, it wouldn't come back to the mother. It wouldn't come back to the father. It would come back to that being in the womb. That shows you how distinct this is from the mother or the father's body. Now, this also includes, again, here, has its own DNA fingerprint, its own genetic code. This includes the gender or the sex of the being in the womb. So obviously, if it's male, then if it's biologically male, then it's very odd to say that it's the mother's body or the woman's body. And if it's biologically male and has a penis, right, or other organs associated with biological males. Or even if it's a biological female and it has its own organs in that regard, it doesn't make sense to say that the mother has 2 of each of those, right, or 4 of each of those. And again, if it's male, it even gets even more odd to try to make that sort of claim. So at the very moment of conception, its own genetic code, has its own DNA, has its gender, its biological gender in that sense is completely determined already. It has its own blood type. Again, if it's different than the mother's blood type, which is common, many children don't have the exact same blood type as their mother. So it has its own gender, it has its own blood type, it has its own brain and nervous system, it has its own DNA code. Clearly then, this being in the womb is obviously not part of the mother's body if it has all of these distinct features itself, unless you're willing to say that humans all have double and triple of these things. But here's the other thing. If we examine the DNA and the genetic code of this particular being, and we didn't know the age of this particular being, it would easily be concluded as what? It's right here on the slide. It would be concluded that this being in the womb is human. That this is obviously not a Greg Koukl makes this joke again, a tomato being or a rutabaga being, right? This is clearly not going to come back in our scientific laboratory and the results be that it's a fish, right? Or that it's a chihuahua, right? It's going to come back that whatever this thing is, whatever the sample that you gave me, this is human, right? This is a human. So, genetically speaking, there's nothing different from the being in the womb, right? And I believe this to be very interesting, that the being in the womb, genetically speaking, there's nothing different than his or her 90-year-old counterpart. So you, for instance, at the very moment of conception, genetically speaking, there's nothing different about you now than there was then. And there will be nothing, genetically speaking, different from you at age 90 than when you were conceived. This being's DNA code does not change. It's distinctly yours. It's distinctly, the DNA code for the being in the womb is distinctly the being in the wombs, right? It's not the mother's nor the father's. So again, clearly then, this being in the womb is human. Whatever this is, it's human. Now, as mentioned, the philosophical objections then arise in many sorts of forms. So some might say, well, it is part of the woman's body, right? Or no, it's too small. A fetus is clearly not the same as me, right? But it is inside the mother's womb, or it depends upon the mother to survive. It wouldn't be able to survive if it didn't have the mother. Now, notice these are all philosophical objections. These aren't scientific per se objections. These are assumptions, presuppositions rather. Now, the first objection is not philosophical. I should clarify that. Because it's part of the woman's body would be something like a claim about the structure, the DNA code, the genetic information, and whatnot. But again, right here on the slide, as revealed biologically, the human being is separate, right? And distinct as revealed by the separate genetic code, DNA, separate gender, the separate blood type, separate nervous system, all these things that just aren't, right, the mother's, right? These are the being in the wombs, right? They belong to it, right, whatever it is. Now, it is, however, dependent upon the mother's body, which is a philosophical objection. And that seems to be irrelevant for reasons that we'll see in just a moment. Now, all of these objections, though now admitting that the being in the womb is actually human, they must now try to distinguish between a human being from what? If everyone admits that this being in the womb, whatever this thing is human, that's, again, uncontroversial, scientifically undeniable that this is human, well, now the real danger comes because it turns to philosophy. And the philosophical objection is that they are not a human person. So the concession is, all right, it's a human being, but there's a difference between a human being and a human person. Those are not necessarily synonyms. Human person is not necessarily a human being, and human being is not necessarily a human person. Now, if you're thinking right now that sounds a bit arbitrary and odd, and frankly radical, I would agree with you. And we're going to try to go through the arguments as to show why it is arbitrary, odd, and ridiculous to try to argue that there is a difference between a human being and a human person, right? As mentioned, these distinctions are absolutely arbitrary. There is no good, principled reason to distinguish human beings from human persons. And the history is littered with the tragedies of trying to do this. The Dred Scott decision. Again, this is an example brought up by either Schwartz, Koukl, or Klusendorf, maybe even all 3 points examples like this Dred Scott decision. If you'll remember that, the case of Dred Scott in the Supreme Court, remember this compromise that at that time the Supreme Court said that African Americans, that blacks at that time were only 3/4 of a person, even though they were human beings, right? So the concession was made that blacks at that time were human beings, but they weren't really fully human persons, and therefore you can fill in the ramifications, the tragic, horrific ramifications of that. We can look at where history has shown us where Nazis tried to argue that the Jews were, well, they're alive, they're human beings, but they're not worthy of life, right? When we try to make these distinctions between human beings and human persons, it's just, to be very blunt, it's hellacious, right? The results are just hellacious. They're tragic and they're horrible when we try to say there's a difference between a human person and a human being. In fact, I might say this. Noting that most of us probably don't have a degree in philosophy, yet you're determining the value or you're saying the difference between a human being and a human person is a philosophical issue, yet we don't have degrees in philosophy. Well, then you need to be very sure that you have a supreme grasp on philosophy if you're going to allow philosophy to tell you the difference between a human being and a human person. Why? Well, because apparently you can kill or you can terminate human beings, but you can't terminate human persons. So you'd better know for dang sure, right, to use a southernism there, the difference between a human being and a human person. Or you can rightly reject such an arbitrary distinction. Now, these arbitrary reasons, I would argue, are easily exposed. So Schwartz, and again, Klusendorf, Kokel, Wilcox, all of these individuals that use this flavor of argument use what's called the S.L.E.D test, and it's an acronym, right? Each letter standing for something substantial here. So Schwartz has developed a very effective test to reveal the arbitrary distinctions between supposed human beings and human person. And that is the S.L.E.D test. So the first is, first let me say this. The test reveals that there's no principal distinction between human beings / persons inside the womb with human beings / persons outside of the womb. And so this test would reveal that there are merely 4 differences, again as the acronym suggests, S, 1, L, 2, E, 3, D, 4. There's only 4 differences between these beings, between a being supposedly and a person. So the S would be the size, L would be level of development, E would be the environment, degree, or D would be the degree of dependency. Now, let's go through those slowly. Let's cash these out. S, size. L, level of development. E, the environment. D, the degree of dependency. Now, all of these objections that this human being, this being in the womb, is not actually a human person, they're going to fit into one of these divisions, either size, level of development, the environment, or the degree of dependency. Any of these objections that someone may try to give to try to argue that the being in the womb is not actually a human person is going to fit within one of these particular categories here. So S, let's go with size. Here's an objection. Well, someone might say, well, it's too small, I can hardly see it. Or it can't actually be, it's not like me because look how small this thing, but again, what does someone's size have to do with their intrinsic value in the moral sense? Again, the example is, a professional wrestler that weighs 350 pounds opposed to me 170 pounds or so. Is he more of a person because he's bigger than I am? Or is he more of a person, does he have more value intrinsically as a human being, as a human person than you do because he weighs more than you? Or let's say that he's 7 feet tall and you're 5'2". Are people that are 7 feet tall more of a human than those that are 5'2"? Well, clearly, neither one is more of a person than the other simply because of size, right? Size doesn't seem to have any relevancy in the moral sense of what the pro-choice advocate would want to claim here. Moreover, we could do a thought experiment, and remember the movie Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Would it have been morally okay? Are they not persons when they were reduced to the size of an ant than they were when they were given back their normal biological features in regards to their size and whatnot? It just seems that size is completely irrelevant to whether or not someone is or someone is not a person. Again, we can see this here on this side, on these two slides. Now, what if one were to say that, well, they're not aware of his or herself, or it doesn't look human, or it's not developed like me and whatnot? Again, all of these are going to fall into these categories. For instance, this here, it doesn't look human. Well, that's which one do you? Let me just ask you: if someone says well, it doesn't look human, what is that? Which category would that fall into? Level of development, right? Because they're trying to gauge their personhood, whether or not this is an actual person, simply on their level of development. Meaning this, toddlers, right, don't look like teenagers, right? But that doesn't mean that toddlers aren't human persons just as teenagers are human persons. Yet toddlers don't look like infants, right? Yet infants are human persons just as toddlers are human persons. Infants don't look like septuagenarians, right? 70-year-olds. But 70-year-olds are human persons and toddlers are human persons. Of course they don't look like one another because you're comparing your stage of development with that particular stage of development, right? Every toddler at one time went through that stage of development that you're looking at and saying is not human, right? Well, you can't show me any human person that didn't look exactly like that at that stage of development. Just like you can't show me any human person that's alive now, any human person that's a teenager, you can't show me any teenager human person alive now as a teenager that didn't look like a toddler when they were a toddler at that stage of their development, right? All of that to simply say that that's exactly, apparently, what a human person or a human being does look like at that stage of their development. There's countless examples of this, right? So if you have female children and they're only, 6 to 7 years old, somewhere in that range, well, their sexual organs are not completely developed at all. Does that mean that they're not a human person or they're less of a human person than a 30-year-old female because her sexual organs have completely developed? Clearly, neither one is any more or less than a human person simply based off their level of development, right? Or, well, they're not aware of themselves. Well, right, when people are asleep or they're in a coma, they're not aware of themselves, right? But again, that doesn't mean that you can terminate them. That doesn't mean you can kill them. That doesn't mean that they're not human persons simply because they are not aware of themselves, whether it be because they're in an accident or in a coma, or whether they're simply asleep and you're talking, standing right in front of them, they're not aware of you nor themselves. It just doesn't follow that awareness makes you a human person or not a human person. Specifically when we have examples of people that aren't necessarily aware, but are still nevertheless that, people, human persons, right? Now, these are just more of examples where I've stated on the previous slide. I went ahead and went into depth there, but this is just an example on a slide of showing the same argument. Does the level of development of a human being determine its value? Children up to a year old are not aware of themselves, nor are those in deep sleep, comas, or Alzheimer's patients. Are there any humans that did not look exactly like that at their own stage of development, if that's going to continue to be an argument, right? Again, here we go. Again, the same example. 2-year-old females have not developed their reproductive capability. Should older females possess more value or rights than younger? Are they more of a person? Now, the second would be this third would have to be the environment, right? Well, it's still in the womb. How can this human being actually be a human person? It's still in the womb. It's there. It's not here. All right, so Scott Klusendorf likes to give the example of crossing the street. If I go over to that side of the street as opposed to this side of the street, or if I walk over to that side of the room as opposed to this side of the room, where I am? What does that have to do with my, in the moral sense, the moral punch that's needed? What does that have to do with whether or not I'm a human person or whether or not I'm not a human? If I'm not a human person, rather, where does where I am? What does my environment have to do with my personhood? Right. I forget specifically who gives this example, but we can think of newborns, right, that were twins. One was taken out of the womb for various reasons that needed medical assistance. Well, when it was out of the womb and put in the NICU there and receiving medical assistance, well, it would have been illegal to terminate that child. Yet the twin that was still in the womb, it would be legal to terminate that child. Now, what if that was reversed? What if it was the other that was taken out and was given medical help and was living in the NICU as a premature infant, and it was the other that remained in the womb? Well, why did taking one out make one a human person and leaving the other a not a human person, when it just as easily could have been reversed? The other could have been out and would then therefore have been the human person, and this would have been the non-human person. Or what about identical twins? One was born 5 minutes earlier than the first. So even though they're virtually the same age, one happens to come out and that one's now legally a human person that has rights and can't be terminated. But the one who hasn't been born yet, still in the womb, could be. Yet again, what if those two were reversed? Well, now that one's the human person and this one's not the human. How arbitrary and silly do these distinctions seem to be? As Kogel likes to say again, what does a 6-inch journey down the birth canal have to do with magically making you a human person? Right? How does that make you a human person simply because you happen to go that distance, or even a C-section? Right? And again, that's the environment, right? Does the environment in which a human being finds itself determine his or her value? If a human being is on one side of the street, again, we've already went through this. If two babies are identical in age, say 28 weeks, does one have more value on this side of the skin than the other on the other side of the skin, undelivered? Does changing locations change what it is? I'll say that again. If the fundamental question is what is the being in the womb, does changing locations change what the being in the womb is? It seems to be arbitrary. Now, this last, the D, for degree of dependency. Well, it's dependent on its mother to live in the womb. It couldn't survive on its own, etc., that sort of thing. But again, remember, of course, an infant, a newborn, is completely dependent upon its mother for its survival, or at least upon some person for its survival, right? So why, simply because it's dependent on some person or on its mother for its survival, why would the infant be a human person but not the other, the being in the womb that's dependent upon its mother for its survival? That's not even to say that what about those who are on dialysis machines, who are on insulin pumps, those with pacemakers, with some sort of medical device that they're completely, respirators. They're completely dependent upon something else for their survival. Yet that doesn't make them a human person or not a human person. Again, that seems to be completely irrelevant. It would seem, therefore, to be shown that the distinctions given for human beings and human persons are, one, simply arbitrary, and two, they reduce to absurd conclusions regarding human beings that we already know to be human persons, right? Again, if you're going to say that because, well, it's completely dependent upon its mother for its survival, therefore it can't be a human person, well, then now you're going to have to say that even infants and children up to a year of age are not, because they're completely dependent, and they're not human persons, right? This is a complete contradiction that we know to be false. So, in conclusion, this being in the womb, biologically speaking, is clearly living and it's clearly human, right? This is conceded that it's a human being. Now, the argument reveals that from conception, both points are accurate, right? The being is alive at all points, and the genetic and scientific facts reveal that the being revealed this being to be human. Again, what else could it be? It's not, you know, two humans produce humans, right? They don't produce some other thing, right? Now, the S.L.E.D test, again, the acronym S.L.E.D, size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. This reveals that there's no principled, non-arbitrary distinction between what it means to be a human being and a human person. Remember, when we try to make these sorts of discrepancies, of these, like a lot of philosophers say, and even lay people say that I love the saying, is that that's a distinction without a difference, right? Well, there's a difference between a human being and a human person. Well, that sounds like a distinction without an actual difference. And I think that's exactly what we have when we try to distinguish between human beings and human persons, as history has shown us. And I think if we go all the way back to our first formulation of the syllogism, that it's immoral to take an innocent human life, abortion takes an innocent human life, therefore abortion is immoral. I think that this is a very strong argument, no matter what side of the aisle one happens to follow, whether they be Christian or Jewish or religious in some context, or whether they be secular, pro-life. I think this is just a very strong argument that needs to be taken to the street, so to speak, utilized in regards to this specific ethical consideration. So hopefully, guys, we've finished up the course. I'm sure that you've busted your tail, to say, give a southernism there. I'm sure you worked hard, and I'm hoping that you gleaned a lot from this course, that you've actually got things that you can use, and not just use, but things that you can think upon, things that have stretched your mind. Maybe taking your little old brain to places that it hasn't previously been, right? Taking your mind on some interesting journeys, interesting adventures, interesting intellectual pursuits. I'm hoping that you can get a lot out of this course, or that you did get a lot out of this course. And then specifically, I hope that you got something out of this last argument that we went through. It's my pleasure teaching you guys. It's my pleasure being your guide through this course. And I hope to see you again in the future at some point. Adios. Vaya con Dios, amigos.